The topic for today is going to be called Relying on the Grace of God. Relying on the grace of God. So, the scripture is going to be coming from 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And it reads, I'm just going to kind of skip around in chapter 12. So it reads, verse 3. I know that this man was caught up in paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Let's skip down to verse 7. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of suppressing greatness of revelations, a thorn was given me in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. Verse 8. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, Paul said, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses. I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And we're going to skip down to verse 10. It says, for the sake of Christ, then I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecution, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So, I'm sure you all know the story about Paul, how he had a thorn in his flesh, and how he had asked God to remove this thorn. He had asked God to remove this thorn 3 times, and God said that he would not remove this thorn. He told him that his grace was sufficient for him, that his grace was sufficient for him, that his power would be made perfect in Paul's weakness. So God said, my grace, he said, my grace is sufficient. He said, my power that's perfect in your weakness. And God said, it's my power that will rest upon you. So God was not going to remove this thorn in Paul's flesh. So Paul said, he said, since God is not going to remove this thorn, he said, I'm going to gladly boast in my weakness. I'm going to gladly boast in my weakness, so that the power of Christ can rest upon me. So that the power of Christ can rest upon me. And I think that is just so powerful, that when in our weaknesses, in our calamities and circumstances and situations, that the power of the Lord will rest upon us. So let's talk about 3 things on just for a few minutes. The thorn. The thorn made Paul feel weak, and it made him feel powerless. And sometimes, instead of God removing a thing in our life, he would give us the strength to bear it. He would give us the strength to bear up under it. And he shows his strength through our weaknesses. And sometimes he won't remove them. He won't remove those thorns in our flesh, but he will give us the grace to go through that particular thing, or stand up under that thorn that's in your flesh. Number 2, let's talk about the word sufficient. God told Paul, he said, my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is more than enough. God's grace is more than enough to meet any situation, to meet any infirmity, to meet any calamity that we may come up against. We have to believe God's grace is sufficient, and we have to believe that his power is sufficient for us, because we are insufficient. So we have to trust in his sufficiency, because we are insufficient to deal with that particular thing on our own. We can't bring deliverance to our situations and circumstances. We have to trust and rely on the power of God, and we have to trust and rely on his grace to sustain us, on his grace to keep us. That's why he said that his grace, he said, my grace is sufficient for you. And we have to constantly rely on his grace. And the third word that I want to point out, of course, is the word grace. He said God's grace is available to us at all times, and he freely gives us this grace through Christ, and it's more than enough. His grace is more than enough for us. His grace is the very strength of God. It is the power of God to fill and to fill that lack that we have, and to cover us in our circumstances, in our situations. It is the grace of God that we need to carry us through. It is the grace of God that empowers us to do his work. It is the grace of God that helps us to carry out his will for our life. And it is the grace of God that keeps us and sustains us, and that carries us through any situation, circumstance, sickness, whatever that's coming upon us in our life. It is the grace of God that keeps us. And Paul said that he was making a boast in his weakness to allow the power of God to rest upon him. I know that sounds absolutely crazy. Who wants to boast in their weaknesses? Who wants to boast in their infirmities? Because at that particular time, you're not feeling too good. You're hurting. You're going through pain. So who wants to boast in their infirmities? But when we boast in our weaknesses, we allow the power of God to rest upon us. And when the power of God is resting upon us, he can manifest his power, and he can manifest his glory. And God don't want any flesh to glory in his sight. So when we allow the power of God to rest upon us, it's his power, his grace, his anointing that is resting upon us to carry us through. So I want to share a story with you in Judges 7 that really exemplify the grace of God and the power of God. In Judges chapter 7, Gideon was up against a battle with the Midianites, and God told Gideon that he had too many men. He told them that they were it was too many for him to deliver them into the hands of the Midianites. Now, God don't want, as I said earlier, he don't want any flesh to glory in his sight. So he said they would not be he don't want them to claim no glory for themselves and say that they saved themselves by their own hands. So this is what God did. God said, get rid of some of these men. He said, all of these men who is fearful and afraid to fight, he said, send them away. And Gideon, the army that Gideon had, they had 32,000 men. And by the time the other men was sent away, Gideon went from 32,000 to 10,000 men. There was a lot of men that went back. Because, see, God wanted the odds to be so bad. He wanted the odds to be so bad that the victory will only be made known that it was him and him alone that brought them victory. So, how many of you have been in a situation where if the situation was going to get fixed, if the situation was going to get changed, it was going to only be by the grace of God. It was going to only be by the hand and the power of God that was going to bring you through. And our smallest, and even our weaknesses does not even matter to God. This is where he's going to show himself strong, through our weaknesses. So, continuing on with the story, God still said, even with the 10,000 men, he said, it's still too many men, Gideon. You still got too many men. Let me do another test for you to get rid of some more men. We need to narrow it down. Make a long story short, it was narrowed down to 300 men. So Gideon went from 32,000 to 300 men. And now God is saying, I can work with you now. I can do what I want to do now. So it's harder sometimes to rely on God and just rely on his grace when we got other resources. But when we are stripped of those other resources and we have nothing else and nobody else to rely on but the grace of God, then that's where God wants us to be. So God told Gideon he said, Gideon, go down to the enemy's camp. He said, I want to hear what they're saying in the enemy's camp. Make a long story short, one of the soldiers had a dream, and it was a dream of a barley loaf of bread that came down in the camp of the Midianites, overturned the camp, and tilted, and the tents collapsed. And to make a long story short, I asked, oh Lord, well, why was it a loaf of barley bread? And the barley bread really represented that it was weak and not capable to take on the army. And the soldier said that he said, this is the champion. This is nobody but the sword of Gideon that's going to, that the Midianites is going to be delivered into his hands. So really, God sent him down to the enemy's camp to give him a word of encouragement and to give him example of how it doesn't matter with how the odds are against you. He will show himself strong in your weaknesses. He will show you himself strong in your weaknesses. So, moving on with the story, when Gideon got back to the camp, now the Midianites, their men, they had so many men that you couldn't count them. You couldn't count the men, and you couldn't count the camels. They had the odds were definitely against them. But when they went back to the camp, I want to point out the weapons that they gathered. They gathered a trumpet, they gathered a pitcher, and they gathered a torch. Now, what kind of weapons was this against such a mass army with the Midianites? But they blew their trumpets, the pitchers broke, and the enemy was surrounded by the torch lights. And the rest is history. They ran, and the swords turned on one another. And in 1 Corinthians 1:25, it says, for the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. So I just want to encourage you today to I know this sounds crazy, but we need to make our boast in our weaknesses, not in self-sufficiency, and let the power of Christ rest upon us. Let him show himself strong in our weaknesses, and just know that the grace of God is sufficient to cover and to carry us through any situation, any circumstance. And I just want to leave 3 points, well, actually 4 points with you on today. That God's grace is more than enough. It's exceeding in excess. Number 2, in our trials, whatever trials that we're going through, tribulations, whatever thorns that we have in our flesh, it keeps us from being exalted above measure, and it keeps us from pride and self-sufficiency. It keeps us dependent and reliant on God for his grace. Number 3, our weaknesses is just a portal for God's power to show up. And number 4, rejoice, boast in your infirmities, because it puts us in a place of victory. And just rely on the grace of God. So I just want to say thank you so very much for joining me on today. I invite you to go to my website to check out my Flourishing with Purpose t-shirts that I have for sale. And also I will be putting my Flourishing with Purpose journal on my website very soon for purchase as well. Of course, the Flourishing with Purpose Academy is still under construction, and I believe that is it. And I want to say thank you once again for joining me on today. I hope to see you on next Wednesday. Go out, make it a flourishing day, be blessed, and have a wonderful day. Again, thank you so much for joining me. Bye-bye.